Shalom. So it looks like we are online. Several months ago, like 4 months ago, I wrote. I looked up Nehemia Gordon because his name was coming up, and just to see like what kind of stuff he says. And what happened, and I was watching one of his videos, and it was just so obviously bad and wrong that I left a comment. This is, why don't I just read the comment that I said? Where's my comment? There's my comment. This is the perfect example of how dishonest Nehemia Gordon is. Virtually nothing he says here is factual or complete. And at the time, I wasn't gonna bother it. I wasn't gonna bother, but somebody replied to my comment and said, "Well, how?" And so I decided, you know what? I will watch the video again and explain exactly what I meant. Now, I've spoken about this before. What really, really bothers me is that there are, especially Israeli Jews, but half the Jews in the world live in Israel. So I don't see it as much in the United States, or maybe I haven't noticed as much in the United States. But there are people who realize that especially evangelicals have a very strong philo-Semitism, right? They have a love for Judaism and the Jewish people, and generally, I mean, it's because they're good Bible-believing people. And so unscrupulous people decide to take advantage of that. And to some extent, people who are more scrupulous have to accommodate the market for like Judaica with things. I was once in a Judaica store. I've told this story many times. I was once in a small Judaica store, and this tour bus from South Korea showed up. And visitors got out to look at the Jews in their natural habitat. I mean, it was so cliche. They had video camera, they had their cameras out and stuff, and they were really excited, and they wanted to buy all sorts of Judaica. And I knew that the person who owned the store was obviously a religious Jew. He wasn't going to sell them, for example, actual phylacteries with the scrolls in them. So he sold them the boxes. And actually sold them below what a lot of these people would end up buying if they just went online and stuff. So he wasn't trying to fool them, but it was obvious that if he didn't sell it to them, they would end up at a charlatan getting more overpriced, more junky type things, and it's a huge problem. It really is a huge problem. People especially, and I think part of the reason is some people, especially Israelis who aren't religious, they speak Hebrew, and they see this advantage in their Hebrew speaking ability, and it just it bothers me a lot. It really, really bothers me a lot when I see good meaning religious people in their faithfulness turning to someone that they think um, is being honest with them. And you know, I'm not just saying Nehemia is being dishonest because I disagree with him. There are people who I have honest disagreements with, and I know that they actually believe what they say, and they are saying things in a manner that would um, that that is honest and helping people. And then you see certain ministries where people who claim to be Jewish um, are really just obviously just talking to Christians in a way that will not be offensive to them, or will, in fact, um, play into a lot of the things that they, confirmation bias, and just basically feeding them what they were looking for to begin with. And that's what Nehemia Gordon does. That's what I see in him, and we'll go into the examples. But for example, he claims to be a Karaite Jew, and he claims that Karaite Judaism is the original Judaism before all the rabbinic stuff was added, and the people who are like trying to stay away from the leaven of the Pharisees and don't understand the actual context of that word and what everything that goes on along with it. He It's gotten to a point where he has started announcing when the new months are in Israel, and there are more than a few Gentiles who actually observe Passover based on Nehemia Gordon deciding when the months are. And this is so incredibly ahistorical. There, it is just so. I don't even know what to say. Karaite Judaism is not a straight holdover from Sadducee. What existed. There is no continuing community of Sadducees, right? I guess the closest you could get to that is the Samaritans, but there are a very small number of Karaites, and it is a breakaway heresy from Rabbinic Judaism, which is obvious in a lot of things, and when you know the history, and there's a reason why basically there are very few genuinely religious and knowledgeable Karaite Jews, and the community, I mean, it's trying to reconstitute itself, and it's started doing, but it's not a viable long-term Jewish community. And Nehemia Goldberg has in fact started becoming inordinately powerful within that community just because he has all the Christians, and he's started converting people to Karaite Judaism, which is a little funny because the Karaites didn't believe in conversion. And so he claims that he grew up in an Orthodox Jewish environment. I guess that could be true. I don't know. He says his grandfather was a rabbi, maybe. What he certainly knows more than the average bear, but that doesn't make him into an honest broker teaching people about stuff that he actually believes in an honest way. So with that whole preamble, I am going to start watching this. Now, obviously, boiling a kid in its mother's milk, it is a Hebrew, in the Hebrew Bible. It's in the Bible. It's in three, it is restated 3 times, right? So, and because of that, we have a tradition, which he knows, that there are no extra repetitions in the Bible. And because of that, we understand the Bible to be, in fact, talking more broadly, but we're also very careful about what is, and then there's an additional rabbinic component to it. And this is the classical example. There is a commandment, a prohibition of adding to the Bible or taking away from it. And the classic example that's given within Judaism is to say that cooking a cow in milk is not included, right? Because that's not how we read the Bible. So that would be taking away from the Bible. There's a reason why it mentions it 3 times, and we have a tradition, as far as I know, it goes way back. It's not like somebody suddenly decided, oh, Jews are going to suddenly start to have separate dishes, and you know, this is something that goes way back, right? So certainly thousands of years, but it's not a sudden thing, and it is something that the only Jewish communities which have survived, this is how we contextually read the Bible. Now, there is a rabbinic prohibition of like fowl and so like chicken, poultry, and dairy products, which is the classic example of, if you were to say that this is from the Torah, then you are actually also you are adding. So it is prohibited to take away from the Torah, and it is prohibited to add to the Torah. What are rabbinic injunctions, we treat separately, and it's incredibly important to us to do that, because to do otherwise is to actually go against the commandment not to add or take away from the Torah, right? Okay, so that's the Jewish understanding. That's the Jewish tradition. Yes, Father Timex, I am actually live. So just making sure. Okay. So let us go ahead and start.
One of the pieces of pushback I get from Orthodox Jews is, well, if it doesn't mean don't eat chicken and cheese together, then what kind of command? What a weird commandment! Don't boil a kid in his mother's milk.
Chicken and cheese? There is no Orthodox Jew who is going to say if it doesn't mean chicken and cheese. He's automatically lying, just straight out. No Orthodox Jew is going to say that to him.
Why would God command us such a thing?
למען ציון לא אחשה, ולמען ירושלים לא אשקוט.
You are listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemia Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemia's McCore Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiaswall.com.
Welcome to the B1 Radio Show. Here are your hosts, Jeff and Sherry Friedlander.
We have a biblical scholar with us. Our friend Nehemia Gordon is with us this morning, and we're so thankful for him. Nehemia holds a master's degree in biblical studies and has a bachelor's degree in archaeology from the Hebrew.
A master's degree in biblical studies isn't a big deal. In Judaism, right? Lifelong study. If you are the degree type and you just have a master's degree, people are going to wonder why you only have your master's degree. But, okay.
University in Jerusalem. He also worked as a translator as part of the Dead Sea Scrolls Project and has been researching and deciphering ancient Hebrew manuscripts for what must be decades.
I have no idea what the Dead Sea Scrolls Project is. I'm guessing it's not an actual thing of the Israeli Antiquities Department, but I don't know.
Now, and is not only incredibly wise and well-studied, but just a great all-round fellow, and we are thankful. And Nehemia, are you there?
I'm here, Jeff. How you doing? Good morning.
Good morning. Welcome, and thanks for taking time this morning to be with us. Our audience certainly appreciates that, and we're grateful. I love your work. I'm on your support team of your website. For those of you that want to join, you can go to nehemiaswall.com, and he has a support team. There's tons of free resources there, lots of teaching, lots of information. You can learn so much from the website, but if you join the support team, there's all kinds of other stuff beyond the scenes that gets in depth, and it's wonderful information. So
he's making money off this, and honestly, I doubt very much he's living as just looking at him. I shave my head, he shaves his head. Obviously, this is not an observant, I'm not trying to fool anyone. I am not an observant Jew. And that's part of the reason why most of the people I talk to aren't Jewish, right? Most of my audience is not Jewish. Because I am not observant. I'm not within the Jewish community. Nehemia Gordon claims to, and in some ways is a leader in, he's taking money from people to convert them to Karaite Judaism. And I don't understand how that jives with the fact he has so many, basically everybody who supports him is a Christian. So
I want to encourage all our listeners to go out to nehemiaswall.com and research it for yourself and take a look at it. Now, Nehemia, for our audience that is new and that doesn't know who you are, kind of give them a little background of you. You are a practicing Karaite Jew, and so kind of describe a little bit about that, of who you are for our audience.
Well, my father was an Orthodox rabbi, and I was raised essentially as a modern-day Pharisee. The Orthodox Judaism is a continuation of the ancient movement of the Pharisees, and they have a core doctrine, which I was taught as a young boy, which is that when Moses went up to Mount Sinai, he received two separate and distinct revelations. One was the written Torah, that is the 5 books of Moses, and the other was what they call the oral Torah. And everything in the written Torah has to be interpreted through the oral Torah. And I was taught this sitting on my father's knee when I was 3 years old. And when I got a little bit older, I started studying the written Torah, and I found in it words or statements such as, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying," and then the prophets, "Thus saith the Lord." And then I would get to the oral Torah, and it would say, "Rabbi Meir says this," but Rabbi Akiva disagrees and says something else. And I went to my...
Okay, so already it makes me wonder. So this is part of the misunderstanding that any Orthodox Jew will clearly know, whereas he is feeding into the confirmation bias, right? So there's this idea that the Jews will misunderstand and think of the oral Torah as scripture and confuse them. And so he's going into this thing. Rabbi Meir says, well, Rabbi Meir says what? He says that this scripture or that scripture, and so it's a commentary, right? The oral Torah is an explanation of the written Torah. So his idea that they're completely distinct No, they're not completely distinct. It's not like we have two books, right? What we have is an explanation of the traditions that go along with the written Torah, right? And it's precisely like how your parents teach you to tie your shoelaces. They don't teach you to tie your shoelaces by giving you written instructions. And the Torah is a practical thing, right? We actually practice the Torah. So when it says in the Torah, you shall write them on the doorposts of your houses, right? These words. Well, which words? How? What exactly is it? And so the Karaites have come up, now they have their own types of mezuzah, right? Which is actually, they came up with it themselves, right? Whereas the mezuzot that we have been, there are mezuzot from Qumran, which is before the time of Jesus. And there are phylacteries from before the time of Jesus. And Jesus talks about phylacteries, and his complaint is that the phylacteries are too big, right? They make, well, whatever that means, that they enlarge their phylacteries. I think he may have actually been talking about people who made too much of a deal about them, not the physical size. But in any case, the phylacteries that we have today are continuations of the phylacteries that Jesus spoke about that have been found archaeologically in Qumran. And if he has a bachelor's in archaeology and a master's in biblical studies from the Hebrew University in Israel, he knows this stuff, right? So already this idea that the oral Torah is an explanation of the written Torah. You cannot study the oral Torah as if it is distinct or separate. It is obviously doing something different, teaching you how to read the written Torah. Without the written Torah, the oral Torah is nonsensical, completely nonsensical. So
My rabbis to my teachers, and I said, these sound like they're just the words of men. They never quote God. They're always quoting rabbis.
they never quote God. I do not believe that somebody who has read a single page of Talmud, open up the Talmud, any page you like. Any page you like. Unless you find some weird desert, I can't even imagine where it would be. It's actually discussing particular verses or talking something related about particular verses. It's bringing up different verses. They never quote God. First of all, even that idea is because there's actually many places in the oral tradition where, yes, God actually does. So he's just saying things he knows are not true in order to help with the confirmation bias of Christians that he's hoodwinking. Open up a page of Talmud for yourself. The entire, both the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. When we say Talmud, we generally mean the Babylonian Talmud, but they're both there. It's not just one of them. They're both in completely available, complete in English for free on Sepharia.org. You can read the entire thing yourself if you like. It will take you a long time. You're going to have a difficult time understanding it. It is very cryptic, and even with the translations trying to explain things, you're going to have a very difficult time understanding it. There are daf yomi. There's daf yomi all over the internet, right? There are classes and classes and classes on Talmud. Pick any of them. On any given day, so there's a 7.5-year cycle, right? So, and during that 7.5-year cycle, if you study one folio page, it's 2 sides of a page. That's what a daf is 2 sides of a page of Talmud. In 7.5 years, you will go through the entire Talmud. So pick a day at random, any day at random, right? And go look at the daf yomi, right? The daily cycle, the people who study on that cycle. Go ahead and listen to what is being taught. He knows he's speaking bullshit. He knows he's speaking bullshit.
Rabbis, and telling us the rabbis disagree. And then I was told when the 2 rabbis disagree, both these and those are the words of the living God. And I said, that doesn't make sense. Why would God contradict himself by giving 2 different messages?
So this is the thing. He knows that Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chaim doesn't mean God contradicted himself. It means we believe that there are ambiguities in the Torah, that the Torah has many ways of being seen and understood. And first of all, halachically, when it comes down to the halacha, we actually don't really say that, because we do decide how, as a community, we're going to move forward, and that is part of that is actually what the Talmud is teaching you. You study Talmud so that you can see people disagreeing on what the words of the Torah mean, and that teaches you to understand how different things can be interpreted in different ways, so that you can have a richer understanding of the words themselves. That's what it's training you to do. That's what the Talmud is. He knows this. I would hope so. But part of the whole thing of the Talmud is, in fact, the discussion and the human. It is human beings trying to engage seriously. And if you read it, you will see that these are people who seriously want to understand what God is teaching us through Scripture. He knows this.
And I was told that there were deep spiritual reasons for it that I could understand one day when I had studied the entire Talmud.
That he could understand one day. I thought I explained it to him, which his father is a rabbi, and his father couldn't. He's claiming his father is a rabbi, so I'm guessing his father would want to explain the deep reasons, and there are deep reasons. There are beautiful things. Rabbi Breidowitz, I just recently heard him give this analogy, and it's such a beautiful analogy. He said, if you have a 3-year-old child or 5-year-old child, right? He said 3-year-old, but a 5-year-old makes more sense to me. And you want to make a birthday cake. If you want the best birthday cake, you're actually not going to bake it yourself, right? You're going to go and buy it from a bakery. So why is it special that you bake it? And not only that, you would even make it even more special, right? So, okay, if you're going to bake it, you would do it when the kid's at school or asleep, or when you don't have the kid underfoot. But what do? You actually bake the cake with the 5-year-old, which is going to guarantee there's going to be eggshells in the batter, right? It's definitely going to make the cake worse, right? So why do you do that? You do that because the involvement is what's important, right? And that is the importance of the Torah. God doesn't need the Torah. God doesn't need your cake, and he doesn't need it to be a perfect cake. He needs us as his children to want to bake the cake, to be involved in his word, in his teaching. And so it's just so wrong in so many ways, and he knows that, or at least he should. And it's obvious. His father didn't try to explain this to him, didn't try to told him, you'll only understand it if you're after, right? Does that make sense to you? That's what a father who is a rabbi would say?
Reached the age of 40 and went through several other
Reached the age of 40 and several other... So he's playing into a particular stereotype, right? So there is a stereotype that some Christians have of the rabbis hiding things from the Jews. And that's how a lot of people explain to themselves, well, why is it that there are millions of Jews reading their Bible? There are at least hundreds of thousands of religious Jews reading their Bible, and they're not converting to Christianity. Whereas Christians are converting to Judaism. What's going on here? And one of the ways they explain it to themselves, and that's why you get things like the forbidden chapter of Isaiah, which is another thing a different ministry does, right? Which, obviously, if you're trying to convert Jews, telling us lies like this will not convince anybody, right? The idea that the rabbis are hiding things from us is not something you're going to tell Jews and have them believe it. It's just ridiculous. And the idea that his own father wouldn't... First of all, the until you're 40 thing is kind of a myth anyway. We certainly don't. But just to answer simple questions like that, are you serious? Will free coffee and donuts after Sunday service Jews? That'll do it more than this type of lie. I'll be honest with you about that. There are far more Jews who converted because of the coffee and donuts and camaraderie and everything that goes along with it. Of course. Well, I mean, Messianic synagogues, it's funny, that was their idea. They're going to have church on Saturday, and they're going to have it be kosher and be Jewish and, do all the things that are culturally appropriate to Jews. And what actually ended up happening is far more Christians converted to Judaism. I mean, just today I heard Rabbi Tobias Singer say something which I myself, he knows more about this than I do. And I've been a little bit dubious of the claim that there are 100,000 Noahides already. Although I have seen things which give me the indication that the number may be even above 100,000. Tovia Singer is one of the best Baptist rabbis I've ever heard. He is very good as a Baptist preacher, and I think he's honest. I do. He is honest, and fake humility. I don't know if he even tries to fake humility. he doesn't really. He's funny. Some people like him, some people don't. I mean, if you don't like him, you don't like him. The main difference I have with him is he believes that Jesus believed in what Christianity teaches, and I don't agree with that. I don't think that's true. So he's hostile to Christianity, and he's hostile to Jesus as part of Christianity, which, I mean, a lot of people are, partially because of the things that it does say in the uncensored versions of the Talmud. But I will tell you personally, I think it's very clear from what the Talmud says that the Talmud is merely interacting with believing what Christians said about Jesus. And I think the biggest mistake Jews have made is to believe what Christians said about Jesus. It's just a huge mistake. Anyway, we're going way off track. But yeah, I mean, he's obviously saying things he knows is not true. He knows these are things he's saying them because certain people will hear it and it'll sound right to them and they'll nod along, and that'll make them his supporters and go to nehemiaswall.com and subscribe. And he's made a living out of this. And it's sad.
Different rituals. And I said, well, I'm not waiting for that. This just doesn't make any sense to me. We should all embrace the word of God and give up the words of men.
Yes.
And I thought...
He's quoting exactly what Christians think, right? And so it's this idea that Jews believe the words of men are more important than the words of God. It's just such a complete ridiculous. It just is. It is completely ridiculous. What is the name for the place of worship for Karaite? Synagogue, temple? Yeah, good question. I think they do actually worship in synagogues. It's not a very coherent thing. It really isn't. And honestly, like, that their Sabbaths are incredibly some of them. It's not a very coherent thing, and he's basically made it into his own thing for his own Well, where did the synagogues come from, right? Okay. He could say the same thing we say, which is that the prophets during the 70 years that between the first temple and the second temple, that the prophets established the synagogue service. But how does he know that? How does he know what we do in the synagogue, how we pray in the synagogue, right? Hosea says, "Take with you words." Which words? And that's what the oral Torah is for. And he knows this. He knows all of this. He knows it's ridiculous and nonsensical to try to practice Judaism seriously. This is what I tell Christians who have suddenly become law observant is, so if you want to have a circumcision, how do you do the circumcision, right? Who do you go to? Who's going to do the circumcision for you, right? Your only choice will be, and what a lot of these Torah observant Christians will end up doing, is having to turn to Pharisaic Jews. And what Nehemia is trying to do, and has actually done, is make the same is make something which is outside the Pharisees, in which he's going to explain real Judaism without the Pharisees. And he uses a lot of just talking points. So Dominic says, so it sounds similar to Catholic Ortho versus Protestant. So this is one of the things that I've noticed, is that in a very real sense, a lot of the arguments that Christianity has with Jews has actually been arguments within Christianity themselves that have kind of spilled over into their arguments with Judaism. And what a Protestant will tell you is that sola scriptura doesn't actually mean sola scriptura, because obviously the first question is, which scripture, right? Which books are in your Bible, right? Where do you find this book, right? Sola scriptura is a self-refuting idea, and Protestants know this. They say that it is in reaction to moving away from the scripture and becoming too involved in traditions and things like that. And this is a fight within Orthodox Judaism, right? At what point are we actually moving away, God forbid, from what God has taught in the scripture, as opposed to what are simply traditions? And that's one of the reasons we are so careful, and it's so important to distinguish between that we distinguish between those things which the Torah says, right, and what is rabbinical or whatever. Yeah, and Dominic says, yeah, honestly, the canon is the best argument for Catholicism and Christianity. I wouldn't say necessarily it's for the tradition. I think Protestants do realize this. Adam says, is there, by the way, welcome, Adam. I'm not sure if I know you. Your name looks familiar. Is there any videos of you explaining these things that are wrong about Jesus from Christians? This is very interesting to me. Yes, yeah, actually, that's most of my videos. And I would say the first thing I would point you to is my video on the Son of Man debate. Unfortunately, it got cut off at the beginning and the end, but the important part's right there, which might actually be a good thing because I do ramble. But that's the video I would point you towards. Okay, let's keep on going.
That I would be praised for coming up with such a great revelation. Well, instead I was rebuked and told that was the heresy of the Karaites. There had always been this movement in Judaism, Karaite Jews, that is scripturalist. The Hebrew word for scripture is mikra or kara, and Karaite and Karaites were Jews who only followed the scriptures. And And I realized that's what I was. And at the time, I didn't know there were any others in the world. I thought I was the only one.
Wow.
But I was told I was the only one. And I was told if you follow this path, then you'll cease to exist.
Wow.
Just like the others in history. I said,
Yeah, like they have, and he knows they. First of all, I mean, even the ones that are alive today, their community is falling apart. But he knows that the modern Karaite movement came from Rabbinic Judaism. There were, like, we trace the Karaite movement, I think, to the 13th century, might be 1,000 years. It certainly doesn't go back to the time of Jesus. He knows that.
I don't care. That's the truth. I have to follow it. And that really set the stage for the rest of my life. Was one of the things I was told was, who do you think you are to interpret the scripture differently than these great rabbis? Generations of rabbis who knew the Bible better than you, who knew Hebrew better than you.
Well, yeah, I mean, part of it is in fact his chutzpah, right? So he's, if you can bring up good questions within Judaism, see, this is one of the things I've noticed about Christian culture as opposed to Jewish culture. If you go to synagogue on a regular basis, the rabbi will say something during his actual sermon, and somebody will challenge him, right? During the service. And I've actually, like, asked Christians if anything like this would ever happen in their synagogue, and in their church, and they're like, during the sermon? No. Like, most Christians would not in any way, like, even after the sermon or privately, question their preacher like that. In Judaism, it's part and parcel of what we teach our kids, right? So the idea that he was told not to question, no, go ahead and question. If you think you have better answers without having... So this is actually something that happened to me. So I've been one of the smarter kids in whatever school I ever went to. And I went to some prominent schools, and so I figured when I went to yeshiva, I would be the smartest kid there. And I figured I would read the stuff that the rabbis, like, said, and, having all my other understanding, I would clearly be able to better understand. And breaking my head on the Talmud, actually, like, understanding the questioning and being trained to question was an incredibly humbling experience. I could see that there have been thousands of years of very, very smart people asking as good a question as they are capable of asking. And serious questions. This is Talmud Torah. This is what the oral tradition is about, is interrogating scripture, is, actually going through every verse in the Bible and seeing how it compares with every other verse in the Bible. It's beautiful, and it's a tapestry that if you think it's just going to fall apart when you tug at one string, you obviously have not wrestled with it the way that any yeshiva bacher is supposed to in a beginning Talmud class. And so I can only guess, best case scenario, he came from actually a very minimal background where nobody was certainly nobody was opening up a page of Talmud for him, and he was not seriously engaging with the text. And sometimes this is actually true, unfortunately, of people who are in the most religious. Sometimes things like that will happen, that there are certain insular small groups that are in fact less willing to actually expose their children to this type of stuff. I'm guessing if he came from some really insular group, he would have said so. I just don't understand what he's saying. I understand what he's saying. He is speaking into those things that Christians kind of assume about Judaism, but it's obviously not true. And he should know that. I think he does know that. At some point, you have to dismiss the idea that it's just negligence. This is deliberate.
You're reading their translations and you think you can interpret it better. So one of my objectives was to be able to...
You're reading their translations? Excuse me? Why are you reading translations? Why is an Orthodox rabbi teaching his kid out of translations? What?
Know Hebrew better than the people who translate it.
Wow.
Learn Hebrew. He supposedly has a bachelor's and a master's degree from Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Nobody, like, what is he even saying?
You were like, hey, I'm not going to take it, man. I'm going to find out Hebrew like them. They're not going to have that on me.
That's absolutely what my objective was. So I ended up moving to Israel, lived there for 20 years, and studied at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, studied Bible. Actually did my bachelor's degree. I did a double major in Bible and archaeology, and then the master's I did Bible. And when I got to the point where I actually knew Hebrew better than the rabbis whose writings I was reading.
The rabbis' writings are in Hebrew and Aramaic. And I'm sorry, is this not as obviously ridiculous? Like, one of the main differences between Judaism and Christianity is that in Judaism we say, and what my whole channel is about, you should learn Hebrew, not a translation. You should engage with the text directly, not a translation. So what is he saying?
It was kind of a profound revelation. I remember when I was very, very young, even before I started questioning, reading Rashi. Rashi was a great 12th century Bible commentator. The way we studied the...
In Hebrew. I can't imagine when he was 12 years old, I'm pretty sure there was no translation of Rashi. Yeah, Dominic says, we have the KJV, we don't need Hebrew. Basically, that's who he's talking to. I'm not sure when Rashi was first translated in a major translation. I mean, I guess there probably were academic translations. I don't think translations of Rashi were... Like, everybody studies Rashi in Hebrew. Rashi is written in Hebrew. So, what is he talking about? He obviously was reading Rashi in Hebrew. Rashi is not a translation to a different language. Sometimes he says, this word is so-and-so in French, but since we don't, almost nobody knows French these days, certainly not the French of Rashi from 1,000 years ago, those translations are curiosities. He must know he's lying. He must. I mean, if you can explain to me how he could be talking this way about, well, everybody studies Rashi in Hebrew. You pretty much have to study Rashi in Hebrew. It's a very new thing that now ArtScroll has these translations of Rashi out, and people have started reading. This is something that's happened in the past 20 years, I would say, that there are translations of Rashi to English freely available.
Scripture was we would read a verse of the Bible, and then we'd read Rashi's commentary. Read another verse, read Rashi's commentary. And I was warned as a very young child, don't ever read the Bible, that is the Old Testament Tanakh, don't ever read the Bible without the running commentary of Rashi or some other rabbi, or it will lead to heresy.
Or it will lead to heresy? First of all, vast majority of Jews start learning Bible even without Rashi. Vast majority of Jews, when they go to the synagogue, hear the Bible straight without Rashi. Yes, when we are starting a child to learn, right, after they've learned how to read, then they start learning with Chumash with Rashi. And then with other commentaries, because, you shouldn't, we don't believe in just like one commentary, right? If you look at what's called the Rabbinic Bible, which is actually what the translators of the KJV, they actually were using the Rabbinic Bible, which is the biblical text, with all of what's called mikraot gedolot, which are the great readings or commentaries, which is, I think, like 10 different commentaries. I know Onkelos is there, which is a translation to Aramaic, but a kind of a commentary because it's not exactly a translation. Rashi is there, Ramban, several other commentaries, Ibn Ezra, the Radak, right? And don't ever read the Bible without a commentary? Who would say that? One of my favorite Rashis, which I keep on quoting all the time, is there's this one verse. It's and he does this several times. The first time is in Genesis. And the comment on the verse is, I don't know what this teaches us. That's all Rashi says. I don't know what this teaches us. And so, what is he saying?
I like to say I'm living proof that that's true. I decided to read the Bible without Rashi's commentary, and I was shocked because I saw in the Tanakh, the Christians call the Old Testament, that there was no evidence of an oral law. My Bible in Hebrew,
there's no evidence of the oral law. He must know the two most famous examples. I like to give a third. The first one is, there is no explanation of what phylacteries are supposed to look like. Right? There's no explanation of that. So, if you are going to wear phylacteries, which from Qumran we have found 2,000-year-old phylacteries, and if you are a Christian, then you see phylacteries are something that existed during the time of Jesus because he mentions them, and he does not say these are out of nowhere, right? So there are such things as phylacteries. In modern day Karaites will say that's symbolic, and they don't actually wear phylacteries, I believe. So as a Christian, you would have to deny that what Jesus said about there being actual phylacteries in order to agree with him that there's no oral law, that there's no indication of the oral law. Another example is it says you shall slaughter animals when you are going to eat them, as I have commanded you. Well, where was it commanded? There are several places in the Bible where it actually talks about other books. The Bible itself references other books. So what are those? Where are those? Aren't what's the Bible saying about that? And one of the examples I like to give is in your Bible, it says that Moses is to command Bezalel to create a menorah in the shape that I showed you. That's what it says, in the shape that I showed you. Does your Bible have any pictures in it? Because the Torah scroll does not have any pictures in it, right? And so God showed Moses a picture of a menorah, which was how Bezalel was supposed to create it. No indication of the oral Torah? He's lying. He knows this. Why are tefillin so expensive? Because they're, first of all, they can only be made by somebody who is commanded to wear them. So they must be handmade by an adult Orthodox Jewish male, first. Second, they're made out of real leather. Just the leather itself is expensive. Working the leather is expensive. So just the boxes themselves. I mean, just creating leather boxes like that are handmade. And it's actually a difficult process. It's funny. I was a little amused when I saw the pictures of the Qumran tefillin that it's obvious they've fallen apart the same way that. So if you've ever seen the process of them being made, like it's actually obvious they're made in a similar manner with especially the head ones, and that's how they get squared and stuff. So that was really interesting to me. But and then what's written inside of them is handwritten with ink and a quill by a calligrapher, a sofer, a scribe. And in fact, this is what the scribes, right, which the Bible, the Christian Bible talks about. One of the basic things that scribes would do was write tefillin, mezuzot, and actual whole Torahs. Now, if you want to buy a whole Torah, they're really expensive. I think the cheapest you can get one is $10,000 to $15,000 because somebody has to sit and write it, and actually every time they write, they actually go to the mikvah. They baptize themselves before they write the holy name. So a lot of scribes actually build a mikvah at home, so it's there for them to use on a regular basis. A mikvah is a ritual baptism. And if you just buy a mezuzah scroll, it's probably going to cost you like $50, and it's only 2 paragraphs. It's a lot shorter and simpler than all the scrolls that are written inside of the tefillin. So tefillin boxes are going to run you at least $250. The scrolls inside they will not sell to vast majority of people will not sell to Gentiles, would be probably another $200 or so, at least. And then it goes up from there. There are people who spend thousands of dollars buying really nice tefillin because they want to, because it's important to them, that they want the best of the best. They want really nice calligraphy. They want it written, very well on good, the best of whatever, and that it can run into several $1,000s.
When I grew up reading was 1,000 pages long based on the size of the print and everything. And in those 1,000 pages, there wasn't one direct reference to the oral law. The fact that the alleged...
I don't even know what to say.
fact that God had given a second revelation.
Right.
And I went to my rabbis and I said, well, where's the verse where God mentions the Ten Commandments that he wrote with his own finger on the tablets of stone? Where does he mention he's giving an oral revelation that was forbidden to write down, that would give the true meaning of the verses of the Torah? And just to give you an example, where it says, don't boil a kid in his mother's milk, 3 times.
Right.
Do not boil a kid in his mother's milk. And the rabbis explain that what that really means is you must not eat meat and milk together.
Right.
Well, wait a minute. It doesn't say anything about eating. It's about boiling. And why would it be forbidden to eat chicken wrapped up in a piece of cow cheese? What does that have to do with boiling a kid in his mother's milk? A kid didn't eat.
Do I have to say anything? Honestly, and now I remember why I found this so obviously a mixture of half-truths and lies. At the very least, if that's your question, point to the verse where it says, you shall slaughter an animal the way according to the laws that I gave you. That is one of the most well-known indications. He knows that. He must know that. Because that's the first thing a Pharisaic Jew, a Rabbinic Jew, says to a Karaite. It's the oldest answer. So why is he pointing to something completely different, something that no Orthodox Jew would actually say is from the Torah?
He was a young goat.
Right.
And the answer is, well, that's the true meaning, that you wouldn't know if you didn't have the oral law. That's why the oral law is so important. So the realization I came up to when I was a very young child, reading Rashi, I said, wow, one day I want to be as smart as him so I can understand how he came to these explanations. Because when I read the verse, I just don't see it.
Yeah.
And I would...
If you actually read Rashi, he will tell you where his explanations are from. He often cites verses in the Bible. And when he doesn't, he says, well, I got this from the rabbis, or I got this from so-and-so. He'll actually say, like, for example, Menachem ben Saluk, right, is one of the people he quotes a lot. He will quote where he got it from. So he knows this is bullshit. And anybody who actually genuinely looks at Rashi, looks at the Talmud, listens to Jewish answers, which he must have heard, would at least honestly portray those things. But when you do that, you're not doing the confirmation bias that certain Christians are looking for. You're not going to become the popular person that he has become among Christians. And so he says the stuff he says, and advertises nehemiaswall.com.
State that to my rabbis. I don't see how you got to this conclusion. And they'd say, well, you just don't know enough. One day you'll know enough like Rashi did, and you'll understand.
No, that's not what they would say. And he knows that.
That. And when I did know enough, that one day, years later, I realized he was just making a lot of it up.
Rashi was just making it up. Anthony, are his credentials legitimate? They look fairly solid. I couldn't find a LinkedIn or academia profile. So, getting a master's degree from Hebrew University in Bible, yeah, I mean, I have no reason to think that his credentials aren't legitimate. It's not like he's done something extraordinary. There are probably thousands, tens of thousands of Jews who have, and Hebrew University has all these master's degrees for people to, semester abroad or spend a year in Israel. He says he got his bachelor's degree at Hebrew University. That actually, a bachelor's degree at Hebrew University Jerusalem is more impressive to me than a master's degree, because it means he got admitted and actually went there. Although I have to wonder, what exactly, because in archaeology, like the archaeology department in Hebrew, at the Hebrew University is serious. I have no reason to think that he doesn't actually know Hebrew. When he pronounces Hebrew, he seems to pronounce it well. The stuff he's saying, he knows he's lying. He must.
Right. And what he was doing was, we have this term in English, which comes from Greek, exegesis.
Yeah.
Right. Ex in Greek means from, and Jesus means to interpret, to read. So exegesis, that is the fancy word for interpretation, is you're reading the meaning from the text.
Right.
But I realized what Rashi and many of the rabbis were usually doing was eisegesis. Eisegesis is when you read into the text. In other words, you come to the text with with an objective. You say, okay, I've got to find proof.
This is a Christian argument against other Christians, and read Rashi. Rashi is available again in English on Chabad.org. It's right there. See if what he's saying is in any way something any reasonable person would say.
It's forbidden to eat meat and milk together. And the rabbis even have a term for this. They say, we want to hang it on a verse. Where's the verse I can hang my doctrine on, my religious practice on? I already know this is what God told me. How do I know that?
No, see, it's not about hanging on a verse. It's about looking at the Torah and trying to understand what it means. And one of the ways we have of understanding the Torah is that the Torah doesn't just repeat itself. It is, when it says the same thing over and over again, it's trying to teach us something new.
My father did that, and his grandfather did it. So what they would do is take tradition, and they would look for some justification for that tradition in the biblical text. And that.
Well, yes. If my father and my grandfather have told me that the meaning of write them on the walls, on the doorposts of your house, means this, I'm going to believe them. And then when at the Dead Sea, at Qumran, they found, which he knows, mezuzot, we see that this is actually what Jews have been doing for thousands of years. Those, like, the Dead Sea Scroll documents have been carbon dated back to before Jesus. They might be from around the time of Jesus, at the most. That
was something that, because the way God wired my brain, I said, no, I can't. That's not the word of God. And to understand how significant that was for me is, came from a long line of rabbis. I had somebody once say, Nehemia came from a line of 33 rabbis. And I went to him afterwards and I said, look, you can't say that. I only know about 3 or 4 rabbis. Well, in 2017, I went down the rabbit hole of genealogy.
And it is a rabbit hole.
It is pretty cool. They have all these databases now where you can look up documents. I was able to find the Russian tax census of 1814 or something. And I found all these ancestors of mine listed there.
Wow.
So I found that I'm descended from more than 50 rabbis.
Wow.
So 33 was a lot more than that.
That's awesome.
It is and it isn't. But I was told that, it doesn't change who I am, right? But I was told, how can you defy the statements of all the rabbis of your ancestry? At the time, I only thought it was 3 or 4. Now I know it's over 50, who knew so much. And my answer was, I have to follow the word of God.
Yes.
I read these words that I believe God revealed to mankind, and I have to follow those, not the words of men.
Yeah.
So that's what it means that I'm a Karaite Jew. I'm an Old Testament Jew. A lot of Judaism today is all about tradition, tradition that they've tried to justify in many cases by finding some verse that alludes to it in the Old Testament, like boiling a kid in his mother's milk means don't eat meat and milk together. But growing up with this background, every moment of my day was legislated by rabbinical law. If I woke up and wanted to go to the toilet, I had to put a kippah on, this skull cap, because it's forbidden to walk 4 cubits without with your head covered.
He's giving an exact example of something that we actually say is a tradition that, for example, Orthodox Jews who are lawyers, if they have a client, so this actually happened during the impeachment of, I think it was the second impeachment, I forget which one, of Trump. There was an Orthodox Jew who was his attorney, and when he drank water, he covered his head, although this isn't really it. I mean, whatever. Orthodox Jews who are lawyers will not cover their head because that's the general rabbinic opinion, because this is just a tradition that we have. We keep it because it is a tradition, right? And yes, we do care about our traditions, but because you are representing somebody who can be possibly negatively affected by how the jury sees their attorney, basically everybody does not wear a yarmulke, does not cover their head when they are representing somebody in criminal court. So he knows that this is something we say is just a tradition, and it's important to us to keep what are just traditions separate from things that are rabbinic enactments, which we also keep separate from what the Torah itself says. These distinctions are incredibly important to an Orthodox Jew. So if he was being taught to become a rabbi, he knows this stuff. And he's just repeating talking points that he knows are false.
Wow. I would ask, where are we commanded in the Torah to cover our heads? When we go to the toilet, when we get up from our bed and walk to the toilet. And I was told, well, it's a tradition, and we're commanded by the rabbis to follow these traditions that have been established.
What happens if you don't obey what the rabbi tradition is? What is the consequence of that?
In fact, in the Talmud it says that if you violate the commandments of the written Torah, the punishment is lashes. But if you brazenly violate the commandment of the rabbis, then the punishment is death.
Wow.
So nobody
I don't even know what to say about this. I just don't.
implements that punishment. I don't know if they ever did, but it's sending you a message. You better take these things seriously. When you light the Sabbath candles, you say the blessing, "Blessed art thou, Lord, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments, commanding us to light the candle of the Sabbath." And I asked my rabbis. My mother used to do this every week with my sisters. It's a woman's practice in Orthodox Judaism. I said, "Where are we commanded to light the Sabbath candles? We're not. We're commanded to obey the rabbis, and the rabbis commanded us to light the Sabbath candles." Wow. So by saying these words,
the funny thing is, I think the Samaritans too. I'm not sure. But I'm pretty sure Karaites also still say blessings, which is, the blessings are found nowhere in the Bible. They are a tradition we have of thanking God. It says it is explained in the Talmud, and Rashi says, which later made its way into the Code of Jewish Law, that it is forbidden for a Jew to have any pleasure, to benefit in any way from this world without thanking God. And so we have all these blessings in which we thank God, and including the commandments from the rabbis, because actually there is a verse in the Torah which says, you shall go to the judges and you shall do as they teach you. There is a verse which says, you shall not forget the teachings of your mother and your father. So,
blessed art thou, Lord, King of the universe, who is sanctified with his commandment to light the Sabbath candles. What we really mean is, blessed art thou, God, for commanding us to obey the rabbis and showing and allowing us to show we're obedient.
Yeah.
And I said, this is adding to the Torah. Deuteronomy 4:2 says, don't add to his word and don't take away from it. And Deuteronomy 12:32 in the Hebrew, 13:1 in the 13:1 in the Hebrew, 12:32 in the English, says
the reason why anybody would be taught quite clearly what is rabbinic and not from the Torah is because of this verse.
Says, don't add or take away from his word. So we're actually told in Deuteronomy, okay, up until now I've given you this gradual revelation of commandments, right? So Noah had a certain set of commandments that weren't known to Adam, and then Abraham had a certain set of commandments that weren't known to Noah. We don't know what that full set is, right? It says he did the commandments and the statutes and the judgments. What were those that Abraham did? I don't know.
Right.
And then in the Israelites in Exodus 12, they get the first commandment to Israel's people, which is this month for you is the beginning of months. As the Hebrew calendar was given to them.
Right.
But they, at that point, knew about the Hebrew calendar, but didn't know about Yom Kippur. They didn't know about a lot of commandments because it hadn't been given them. So it was a 40-year period where there's a gradual revelation for the Israelites as a people. And then finally, at the end, when Moses is giving his farewell speech as he's dying, and this is the last day of his life, and he says to them, let me read it to you in Hebrew.
Yeah, please.
So this is Deuteronomy 13:1 in Hebrew, 12:32 in the English. That's actually significant that in the Hebrew, the chapters were made up later, but the fact that it's separated from Deuteronomy 13 in the English is significant. It was on purpose, I think. He says, all the matter that I command you.
So, if you look at Deuteronomy 13:1 in a Christian Bible, you will see that it is talking about a false prophet. And in Hebrew Bibles, the verse from the end of chapter 12 is actually Deuteronomy 13:1, because and he's right, when they were making the chapter breaks, the rabbis kind of thought it was really important to put those together, partially as a refutation of Christianity. So anti-missionaries sometimes refer to Deuteronomy 13 as the big guns, which is when you have somebody who's going off to become a Christian, you pull out Deuteronomy 13. So he knows all this. He knows that in the Christian Bible, these two verses, the first one being don't take away from the. It's almost like he's mocking the Christians who are listening to him. With this, I mean, really, it's kind of like he's saying this in a way of, haha, you're so stupid, you have no idea what I'm saying to you. And maybe that's how he justifies things to himself. I don't know.
You shall diligently do, don't add to it, and don't diminish from it. So if somebody were to come along later and add or take away from the Torah, well, maybe God decided to abolish this commandment, right? That's what the Muslims say, right?
Right.
The Muslims say that Allah sent Muhammad, And Muhammad said, yeah, there were things in the Torah that I did command, but some of those don't apply anymore, right?
Yeah.
Like, you're not allowed to eat pig, but you can eat rabbit now. Why? Because Allah changed his mind, or that revelation was only for a certain time.
Yeah.
So here's what it says in verse 2 in the Hebrew, verse 1 in the English. It says, when there shall arise among you a prophet or a dreamer of dreams, and he shall give you signs and miracles, and those signs and miracles shall come to pass, that he spoke to you, saying, let us go after other gods that you did not know, and let us serve them. Do not listen to that prophet or that dreamer of dreams. For Yehovah, your God, is testing you, to know if you love Yehovah, your God, with all your heart and all your soul. Wow. So we're told here, the prophet or the dreamer of dreams who will tell you to go astray after other gods, even if they perform genuine signs and miracles, you're not to obey them.
Right.
And the juxtaposition here, Jews have understood to be important. Right? He just said, don't add and don't take away from anything that I command you. And then he says, and even if somebody rises up who's a prophet or a dreamer of dreams, who can perform genuine signs and miracles. These aren't fake. It's not sleight of hand or trickery.
Right.
The prophet has genuine power to perform miracles here. Don't listen to him because he's telling you a message different than what's in this book.
Right.
So if somebody adds to the Torah or takes away from the Torah, they're even if they can perform miracles, you're not to obey them, according to Deuteronomy 13. And so I had these rabbis coming to me and saying, well, we've put a fence around the Torah. What is a fence around the Torah? We've added all these commandments, all these rules and regulations that aren't in the Torah, but they make the Torah better. It's like, today in modern speech we'd say it's Torah 2.0.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no. And it's interesting because what Internet 2.0 means is that the user...
Nobody says that. No, literally nobody would ever say that. There are fences, we talk about fences around the Torah, because the Torah is so important to us that, and when you follow Halacha, you really understand this, right? Something that is a Torah prohibition is incredibly important, and we don't even want to risk getting near to something like that. And so things which could lead or in some way, so for example, on Shabbat, the Bible quite specifically says, you shall not light a fire in your home, right? Okay, so lighting a fire is a Torah prohibition. Well, what about if you have an oil lamp and you add oil to it? Is that lighting a fire? We would say yes. And the rabbis have actually made a prohibition where you're not even allowed to touch something that could only be used to create a fire or something like that. So you're not, if there's a candle, you can't pick it up, right? Unless there are certain things, if you need it, whatever. But just generally, you can't pick up a candle on Shabbat, lest, you light something on fire, right? It's not about enhancing what God says. It's about caring so much that you go an extra mile. And the reason why we are so careful to always say, this is a rabbinic thing. This is something we do not because of what the Torah says, but it's a rabbinic prohibition, and to realize that is partially because if there's something important, right? So the Torah always comes first, right? And so when doing what the Torah says would somehow conflict with any of these things that the rabbi said, obviously we have to remember which one is more important. But also, the Torah says you shall not add or take away from it. He knows that he must know this stuff.
Provide the content. not the websites. So it really, in a sense, is Torah 2.0.
Yeah.
That is, the rabbis are providing the actual daily rituals and observance of the Torah. It's very little to do with God commanded. And that's where my, I suppose, rebellion came from as a child, was God didn't command me not to turn off on and off a light on the Sabbath.
Right.
That's something that you guys have invented. There was no electricity in the time of Moses.
And
God wasn't commanding us to do that.
How do you respond?
Okay, so first of all, if you know what incandescent lights are, turning on a incandescent, now we don't really use incandescent lights anymore, but what an incandescent light used to be was originally it was actually made out of sheep's wool, and that's how light bulbs worked, right? You were actually literally creating a fire. Then you were making the metal so hot but that's even beside the point, right? There's a whole other thing, and he's just repeating talking points that Jews have refuted for thousands of years, and anybody who actually knows their Christian Bible, knows the New Testament, knows the types of things that is there. For example, when it says a Sabbath day's walk. How much is a Sabbath day's walk? Well, there's actually a rabbinic prohibition of walking too far on the Sabbath, because it becomes a type of work, right? He knows this stuff. He must know this stuff.
And I'm sure you've had to face this many times over the years, when the argument is made about oral Torah and this oral tradition, that there are hints, quote unquote, in the Torah of there must have been an oral tradition. For example, there's a passage that says, and I don't remember the reference, I think it's in Numbers.
Deuteronomy 12:21. It's the only passage. Deuteronomy 12:21.
He is well studied.
No, I mean, this is their proof text, right? They've got 2 or 3 proof texts.
Yeah.
Okay, but this really is the only one that's even worth responding to, because the others are like, come on, guys. Any sane person reading this in context would say you're reading into the text, not reading out of the text.
Right.
So here it says in Deuteronomy 12. Now, just give the background. Leviticus 17. God had commanded us that if you wanted to eat meat of a domesticated animal, of a domesticated land animal, that is, there's 3 domesticated land animals that are considered food in the Torah. A pig is not considered food, but if you want to eat, it's maybe food you could feed to a dog after you slaughter it, but not fit for human consumption. So the 3 domesticated land animals are a bull, a goat, and a sheep. Okay. Mm-hmm. So if you want to eat cow, goat, or sheep, I'm a city flicker, I say cow. If you want to eat cow, goat, or sheep, you have to slaughter them as a sacrifice at the entrance of the tent of meeting. That was Leviticus 17.
Right.
Now, on the final day of his death, final day as he is dying, about to die, Moses comes, and he says in verse 20 of Exodus 12, when Yehovah your God will expand your border as he spoke to you, and you shall say, I will eat meat. This was a scenario that hadn't existed for 40 years in the desert. Everybody was walking distance from the tabernacle, and if you wanted to eat a goat, you had to bring it as a sacrifice. You couldn't just slaughter it. And that was significant, because if you brought it as a sacrifice, maybe your wife couldn't eat it. Right? If your wife was during her monthly time, she actually couldn't eat the meat as a sacrifice. Maybe your son was a grave digger, and he went and he buried somebody in the ground, which was a wonderful righteous act to provide someone with a burial, but it also means that you're ritually unclean for 7 days. And you have to go through a 7-day period of ritual purification. It's actually mentioned, if I remember, in Acts 21, that Paul went through that ritual before he went to the temple. So you bring this goat to the tabernacle in the desert during the 40 years, and you slaughter it as a sacrifice. Well, now your wife and your son can't eat it because they're not ritually clean. So there's all kinds of baggage that goes with bringing it as a sacrifice. And we're told the reason that they were commanded to bring it as a sacrifice in the desert is so that they don't sacrifice to the goat deities that they were worshiping. They would slaughter a goat, and then there was some goat spirit that they believed that they were spilling out the blood to, or sprinkling the blood to. Right? They had some idolatry they brought with them.
Right.
So, back to Deuteronomy 12, verse 20, it says, when your soul desires to eat flesh, according to all the desire of your soul, you may eat flesh. And then it says in verse 21, when your border, when the place that Yehovah your God chooses to place his name is too far from you, okay, it shall become distant from you. Well, that couldn't have happened in the desert.
Right.
Because everybody was walking distance from the tabernacle.
Right.
Now we're about to enter the land, and in the land there's new realities.
Yeah.
The new reality is, if I want to eat a goat and I live in the Galilee, I can't bring them all the way to Jerusalem or to Shiloh. It's not practical.
Right.
Well, or maybe I'll only eat once a year. Well, okay. He's saying when when the place that Yehovah chooses to put his name, that is the tabernacle and the temple, becomes far for you, then you shall slaughter of your cattle and your sheep as Yehovah has given you, as I have commanded you.
Yep. That's the argument right there.
Them,
There's the
as I
argument.
commanded you. Okay, and you shall eat in your gates according to all that your soul desires. So where did God command us to slaughter the animals? And so here's what they do. It's actually kind of a bait and switch. They say, oh, let's take just this verse. Let's just read verse 21. God commanded us somewhere to slaughter the animals. And we know, everybody in the audience, we know that the way we slaughter an animal is with a certain type of knife. And the knife can't be serrated. It has to be a sharp knife. It can't be dull. When you slaughter, you have to make a certain motion with your hand. You can't do a chopping motion. It has to be a sawing motion. There's certain rules that we know that God commanded us in the oral law of how to slaughter an animal. And those laws are being referred to here in verse 21 of Deuteronomy 12, as I have commanded you, i.e. in the oral law. Except what happens if we start and read in verse 14? If we read in verse 14, we realize, he commanded us this 5 verses earlier. So verse 14, he says, talking about if you want to eat an animal, or a verse actually says if you want to bring a sacrifice, it says only to do it at the place where God chooses, etc. In verse 15, only according to all the desire of your soul, you shall slaughter and eat flesh according to the blessing of Jehovah your God that he has given you in all your gates. What does that mean, all your gates? That means outside, not just in Jerusalem or Shiloh, where the tabernacle and later the temple is. In any of your cities, when Deuteronomy says all your gates, it means any of your cities. Every city had a large gate, which was a gathering place, like you see in the book of Ruth. Boaz gathers the elders in the gate in Bethlehem. So you may eat in any of your gates, and he says, the clean and the unclean shall eat it. Doesn't mean eating an unclean animal. It means if you're unclean, right? What does it mean you're unclean? Well, it means your son just buried somebody in the ground.
Right.
Your wife is during her month.
Where did he get this from? How does he know that? It says, you shall slaughter as I have commanded you. How are you going to go ahead and do the slaughtering? There were people who were slaughtering animals in the temple, in the tabernacle. This is something that was continued from year to year to year. And honestly, I think this is why he's not going to mention the menorah thing. And he's not going to mention the phylactery thing. This is the only one worthy of responding to. What are there pictures? Where is this picture of this menorah?
Time. So that means you're unclean. That means in Leviticus 17, in that system, during the 40 years, I couldn't eat the goat.
How do you know this? Are you just making it up?
I'd have to, my dad gets to eat it, but I can't eat it because I just buried somebody. I'm ritually unclean. So in Deuteronomy 12:15, it says, well, now that you're going to be in the land, you'll eat according to all desire of your soul. But it says that the clean and the unclean and the clean may eat of it, like the gazelle and the deer. Well, what does that mean? Go back to Leviticus 17. If it was a wild animal, you're not allowed to bring a wild animal to sacrifice to the tabernacle. So you have to understand the whole context here, right?
Right.
You can't just read Deuteronomy 12 by itself because it doesn't make any sense. You have to read the context of what they were told 40 years earlier in Leviticus 17.
Wow.
And so.
So you have to understand the context. Really? The
way you eat a gazelle and a deer is you eat it as a non-sacrifice. What are some of the characteristics of a non-sacrifice? Both the clean and the unclean can eat of it, and you don't eat the blood. Instead of putting it on the altar, we read in verse 16 of Deuteronomy 12, only the blood you shall not eat. Upon the earth shall you spill it, like water. So what Deuteronomy 12:21 is saying, as I have commanded you, it means in verses 15 and 16. How did God command us to eat these animals? Like the deer and the gazelle.
Yep.
To spill the blood on the ground like water. Now, how do I know I'm right? Maybe the rabbis are right. And as I commanded you is the oral law. And it doesn't mean verses 15 and 16. We'll just read on. Right? So he says, as I commanded you shall eat in your gates, meaning not just in the chosen place, according to all the desire of your soul, verse 22, but as shall be eaten the gazelle and the deer, so you shall eat it, the unclean and the clean. Together shall eat it, right? So he reiterates the way he says, as I've commanded you, and then he reiterates the three things. There's three things here, right?
Yep.
There's you can do it not just in the chosen place, any of your gates. You the clean and the unclean can eat it like the deer and the gazelle. And then verse 23, but be strong to not eat the blood, for the blood is the soul.
So if it's just what it's saying right there, why is it saying as I commanded you? Right? So he's saying it's giving you a description, right? And it's telling you what to do and what not to do, right? So what's the as I commanded you for? Not that he can explain all the other stuff, because even, okay, in the tabernacle, how were you slaughtering? What does shchita mean? What does it mean to slaughter? What does it mean to shecht? Does it mean to beat its head in with a club? Is that slaughtering an animal? It says you should slaughter it the way I said. Can you shoot it with a gun? There were no guns, so I guess not.
Not eat the blood with the flesh. You shall not eat it. You shall spill it on the ground. You shall spill it like water. Right. So that's the third thing. Not to eat the blood. So if you follow, so what does as I've commanded you mean? It means these three things.
Yeah.
Now, why are these three things significant? As soon as the Israelites went into the land, and God foretells that they'll do this in Deuteronomy, they start worshiping on the high places. Back in this very chapter, he mentions that at the beginning of the chapter. He says the Canaanites do this, and he says, don't worship Jehovah the way the Canaanites worship their God. That's up in verse 4. He says, do not do so, Jehovah your God. That is, on top of every hill and under every leafy tree, they would set up an altar, and that's what the Canaanites would do, and they would offer sacrifices to Baal. So the Israelites come in the land, and they're supposed to wipe out the Canaanites, so they don't learn their ways. Instead, what do? They say, well, I mean, why put all these good Canaanites to waste? Some good pagans among us, let's just tax them. And they end up, that's what they do, and they end up learning their ways. And the result is, Jeremiah comes along, and he says, the number of your cities is the number of your gods, O Israel. Right? Every city has a gate, and in every city gate there is a statue to a god. And that some people will call that god Baal. Some of the Israelites actually call that god Yehovah. That is the God, the name of the true God, the God of Israel. But they're worshiping him through a statue or through an altar that is outside of the tabernacle and later the temple. So Deuteronomy 12 is a very important passage. The Israelites were very diligent of ignoring it.
Yeah.
Right?
No question.
Without Deuteronomy 12, you cannot understand half of what Isaiah and Jeremiah are complaining about.
Right. That's
and
exactly
to
right.
some extent as well. They're talking about how on every hill and under every leafy tree you're sacrificing. What's wrong with that? So I'm sacrificing.
Well, I'll agree with him. You can't understand what Jeremiah and Isaiah are talking about without reading the rest of the Bible. That I'll agree with.
An animal. I mean,
This may be the first thing he said I've agreed with all this whole time.
and here was the thought process of some of the Israelites, I'm sure. They said the Canaanites love their gods and they sacrifice. I'm going to sacrifice the sheep and not offer some of it to my God. Well, you got to go all the way to Jerusalem. I'm not going to go all the way to Jerusalem. On top of the hill there, somebody set up an altar. Let me use that altar. But that altar isn't God everywhere. And in the desert, they weren't in Jerusalem. Wherever the tabernacle stopped.
I think he adds all of this in order to just take people on a trip and spin them around, because he's not, as far as I'm concerned, addressing the real question.
Can't we have a little altar anywhere that we want? Well, no. He specifically says don't do that.
Doesn't that sound like cultural compromise today?
Well, if you look at the beginning of Deuteronomy 12, one could make a very good argument that it has to do with cultural compromise. I'm going to read this to you. Deuteronomy 12, verse 2. You shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations which you shall possess serve their gods, on the high mountains and upon the hills and under every green tree. And you shall overthrow their altars and break their pillars and burn their groves with fire. And you shall hew down their graven images of their gods and destroy the names of them out of that place, of their deities. And it says in verse 4, you shall not do so unto Jehovah your God. So what it's telling us here is this is the way the Canaanites worship their God, and we should not worship our God the way they worship their God.
And I say amen to that, by the way.
Yeah. and so here we have these pagan practices. And we talked before about don't boil a kid that's mother's milk. And one of the pieces of pushback I get from Orthodox Jews is, well, if it doesn't mean don't eat chicken and cheese together, then...
Chicken and cheese again.
What kind of command? What a weird commandment. Don't boil a kid that's mother's milk. Why would God command such a thing? It seems so random. And God is not illogical, right?
Right.
No, we don't say it's random. We say that it's repeated 3 times.
Say anyway. So we know the answer today. It was actually speculated in the Middle Ages, but it was proven in the 1930s or so, where they excavated at a place called Ras Shamra in Syria, and they found what is essentially the Canaanite Bible. Right? We've got our Bible with the story of how our God created the universe. Well, the Canaanites had their Bible, which was their stories of how Baal and the other gods created the universe, or were involved in the ruling of the universe. And one of the things it says in their documents is that boiling a kid in the milk of its mother was a fertility rite to the goddess Ashtoreth, which, of course, today is Easter. The same word, Ashtoreth, Ishtar, Easter. So boiling a kid in the milk of its mother was...
So that Easter thing, he's absolutely wrong. And again, I think Ishtar, Easter, I think he's just speaking to his audience. He doesn't care. He's just speaking to his audience, confirming what they want to hear.
A fertility ritual. And to this very day in Lebanon, there is because in Lebanon the Canaanites survived. They were up in the mountains, and it was difficult to root them out. And so their culture survived in the mountains of Lebanon.
Right.
And in Lebanon to this day, there's a delicacy, boiling a kid in the milk of its mother. Right? They don't remember it as a fertility rite.
Right.
They remember it as, this is like a wonderful way to eat.
Yeah, and I think that what you're bringing up is that we would find if we go through all of these different
He doesn't talk about the phylacteries we found.
commands that seem to have some other explanation. We would find that the bulk of them are all in that category of this was a worship of a pagan idol. This was the way in which they practice that, and I'm commanding you, don't do what they do. You're going to worship God the way I tell you to do it.
if you ask the question, what is the practical application today? How does that apply to my life, right? I'm not a Canaanite. I don't live among Canaanites. What is the application today of don't boil a kid in his mother's milk? And my takeaway from that is don't partake in pagan rituals.
That's mine as well.
Right?
That's exactly
This is actually
One of the rabbinic understandings is, and I guess he wouldn't say this because Paul ridicules the idea that God gave commandments because he dislikes cruelty. There's actually a commandment: do not slaughter an animal and its offspring in the same day. So that's actually another commandment, because it's funny, like when people look at the Noahide laws, the one they really wonder about is the one about animal cruelty, about eating an animal without slaughtering it. And because Judaism has pretty much always believed that animal cruelty is a sin against God.
a message in the New Testament. I'm an Old Testament Jew, but I study the New Testament. One of the messages in the New Testament, which carries over from the Tanakh, is this exact message, where it talks about not eating food offered to idols. Now, they're not talking about, going to the pagan temple and you're standing there and they slaughter the animal to Zeus and you're splashed with the blood and then you eat the meat. What they're talking about is you go to the marketplace and they say, hey, this meat is 50% off. Why is it so cheap? Well, it was sacrificed to Zeus, and since he can't eat it, the priests want to make some money, so now they're selling it. Whoa. I don't want any of that.
Right.
Dominic's asking, I thought that was about carrion. What does it mean exactly? Which one particularly are you talking about? The ever been a chai, animal that hasn't been slaughtered?
I don't want anything to do with that.
Zeus is losing his shirt on the deal. It's just not good.
Well, no, it's a great deal for him, because somebody brought this meat to the temple, and by you buying the meat and consuming it, you're doing Zeus a favor. You're consuming it. It's actually a ritual act of you consuming it. When I was a teenager, I was invited to a free vegetarian meal, and I'm like, wow.
Oh, so ever minachai, I mean, this is the explanation that I was given. So it comes from Genesis 9, where God commands Noah that if you are going to eat an animal, you should, which verse? I want to say Genesis, I think it's in Genesis 9. So Genesis 9, okay, so then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you will fall on all the beasts of the earth and on all the birds in the sky, on every creature that moves along the ground, and on all the fish in the sea. They are given into your hands. Everything that lives or moves about will be food for you. But just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything. But you must not eat meat that has its lifeblood still in it. And for your lifeblood, I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal, and from each human being, too, I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made mankind. As for you, be fruitful and increase in number, multiply on the earth and increase upon it. So this is one of the most major places where we learn out the laws of the covenant of Noah. So it says, obviously, do not kill is part of this. Obviously, establishing courts of justice is part of this, because it says that, anyone who kills shall be put to death, right? So that's two of them. Pruvu, have children. That's also, so that's sexual morality, right? That's another one of them. Ever minachai is really verse 4, but you must not eat meat that has its lifeblood still in it. So the rabbinic interpretation of that is that you must kill the animal first. And I was given an explanation which later Rabbi Yosef told me he doesn't think is valid, which is that before refrigeration, people would actually chop limbs off animals and leave the animal alive. But Rabbi Yosef pointed out that's a really good recipe for like spoiled meat and diseased animals and things like that. And really, there was no common practice to do something like that. There's some disagreement whether this actually applies to things like lobster or fish or things like that, especially since they have no blood, really. And also anything that's aquatic, taking it out of the water is considered shchita in Halacha. But the Rebbe once mentioned to somebody that the custom of cooking an lobster live, he thought was something that should not be done. He thought that, even Gentiles. I don't know if he meant that it was halachically that prohibition, but he certainly felt that it fell under that. And apparently that's what they were talking about in Acts 15, where they talk about actually salting. So the way we take the blood out of meat is we salt it, and the salt is supposed to draw out the I thought it mentioned salting, but maybe not. Maybe I'm making a mistake. It says, instead, we should write to them, tell them to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from the meat of strangled animals, and from blood. So cooking a burger well done is not sufficient. Actually, so a burger is a slight problem because I'm not sure about a burger. If you're cooking something over a fire, then the blood is assumed to drip off, and if that's actually what you're going to be doing, you don't have to salt it. And this is a Jewish law. We do not apply this to Gentiles, that they shouldn't, that they need to salt their meat. But yeah, that again, anytime you're trying to do this stuff, when it's practical for you, it becomes a real question of, well, how do I go about doing this? How do I make sure that I am not eating blood, right? So you're not eating the blood itself, but is a juicy steak, how juicy can it be, right? If I sear it on a pan before I put it on the grill, then am I sealing in the juices, like they say, right? But basically, if it's being cooked over an open fire, we generally say that the blood will drip out. But if you're cooking something, that's different. But the Jerusalem Council is saying that no one should eat blood, right? So that's how the Eastern Orthodox understand it. I think the Jerusalem Council was referring to the Noahide laws. It seems to me that they were. I don't know that. So, again, I have this idea that Jesus came to people who, he came to the lost sheep. He didn't go talk to the rabbis. He was specifically speaking and picking his disciples, and this is part of who Mashiach ben Yosef is that he goes to the people who are not knowledgeable. He is in a generation where people don't know, right? And so I don't know how much I personally don't feel like necessarily James was the greatest rabbi, or that the people who hung around Jesus were necessarily the most knowledgeable of Jews. I think it is very clearly modeled around the Noahide laws. So, yeah, that's my take on it. Yeah, and when they say strangled, like strangled animals, that's one of the ways we refer to animals that haven't been slaughtered properly. So, yeah.
Wow, the food's free and it's exotic food, and why would it be free? And the guy said, well, it's at the temple of Krishna in Chicago. I grew up in Chicago. It's the temple of Krishna, and since Krishna can't eat it, everyone's invited to come and eat the food, and by consuming it, the sacrifice goes to Krishna. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not allowed to do that. That's against my Bible.
Right. So let me
actually encountered that exact thing in the 20th century.
Let me get us on a little bit of different. Years ago, you wrote a book called The Hebrew Yeshua versus Greek Jesus. I'm going to give a quick summary of one point here, and then let you kind of just explain some of this, which gets into your current work, which I want people to go and listen to.
I didn't actually know he had written this book. I'm actually kind of curious about it, but I don't want to give him my money.
They can go to nehemiaswall.com to pull up the Hebrew Matthew pearls, if you will, the series of teachings that are going on. Hebrew Gospel Pearls, excuse me, yeah, that's going on between with you and Keith, and you guys are just discussing each verse by verse from a Hebrew Gospel. But years ago, you started down that journey because, if I understand the story correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, a pastor friend of yours or a Christian friend of yours had asked you a question about what seemed to be a contradiction of Matthew chapter.
See, this is he's giving, I think, Christians the hope that, he's on his way to converting.
23 in Matthew chapter 15, where it appeared that Yeshua was telling him on one hand to disobey.
And frankly, if he were to convert, he would lose his business, which is one of the reasons I think he's not.
Obey the Pharisees, and on the other hand, to obey the Pharisees. And he was asking you to help him get some clarification on what those passages were saying. Is that about right?
That's pretty right, yeah. There's what appeared to be a contradiction between the stance towards the Pharisees in Matthew 15, which was, hey, the Pharisees are replacing their own commandments with, or the commandment of God with their own commandments, and that seems to contradict what it said in Matthew 23, where it says, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, therefore all that they bid you observe, that they command you to observe, that observe and do.
And isn't this exactly what we were just talking about in Deuteronomy, essentially, the concept, not the specific, but the concept?
There's definitely a parallel there, and no doubt this is one of the reasons he came to me. Well, I'm sure he asked other people first. One of the reasons he came to me is he knew I was raised as a modern-day Pharisee, and so maybe I would have some insight on this. And my first response was, well, looks like Yeshua, Jesus, is contradicting himself. That was my first response. And then he said, well, could you try to use the tools that you learned at Hebrew University of Jerusalem to look at textual manuscripts and other possibilities to find some possible solution? And I ended up coming upon this Hebrew version of the Gospel of Matthew that was copied by a Jewish rabbi around the year 1380, and it's been preserved, we know today, in at least we know of 28 manuscripts. Some of them are fragmentary, many of them are fragmentary, but we have 28 manuscripts.
I definitely think Jesus was a Pharisee, yes. I think it's pretty clear, and I think most people, most second, Christian scholars believe that he came out of Pharisees. Whether, obviously, most of them will say that he rejected a lot of Pharisee things. There have been people who have changed their mind about that. I personally, so this is my interpretation of Isaiah 53, where it says, he shall go silently to the slaughter like a lamb. He shall not open his mouth. And it says in that verse, he shall not open his mouth twice. My understanding is that Jesus didn't have any new teachings. That's why he didn't actually write anything down. I mean, obviously, if Jesus wanted to leave writings, he could have. He didn't. And I think there's a reason for that. And I think the reason for that is really that Judaism is true. I think it is true. And I think Pharisaic Judaism is true. And I think you see from the places where Jesus says you have to be more righteous than the Pharisees. And his criticisms of Pharisaic Judaism is pretty typical of Pharisaic criticism of ourselves.
Made copies of the Hebrew version of the Gospel of Matthew. And at the time, I was studying a few specific passages that I was asked about. Then later, I wrote a book called The Prayer of Our Father, together with Keith Johnson, and there we looked at what Christians in English know as the Lord's Prayer, or Christians around the world know as the Our Father prayer. We looked at that specifically in the Hebrew version of Matthew. What we're doing now, and maybe you could say it was the COVID that put us in lockdown and kind of limited what we were able to do. So finally we said, okay, let's look at the rest of Matthew starting from the beginning, and if God wills it all the way to the end, as much as we can. We can't get to everything in it, but we're, you think we could, but sometimes we'll spend an hour just in the first verse of the section.
I've noticed, by the way.
We love listening to your podcast.
Well, thank you. So we're now reading it verse by verse, the entire thing from the beginning, as far as we get, right? And Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew, this version preserved by these rabbis in the Middle Ages, it's broken up into 115 sections. So
why did the rabbis preserve that version of Hebrew Matthew, Shem Tov?
Well, the reason they say they preserved it is they were being forced into these debates with the Catholics. And if the Jews won the debate, they would be persecuted by the Catholics. If they lost the debate, they could be forcibly converted to Catholicism. And they said, okay, well, if we're going to do anything, we're going to do it to win. And one rabbi said, what would be a really good thing to do? Because a lot of the debate up to that point was Jews were on the defense. The Catholics would say, but it says this in the Old Testament. It says that in the Old Testament. It says this in the Talmud. And the Jews were always on the defensive. And this one rabbi said, why should we be on the defensive? If we read their book, we could be on the offense. We have to read their Gospels. Well, the Gospels at the time were in Latin and Greek, and they might have been translated into a language called Catalan at the time, or they were a little bit later in Spain. And this one rabbi said, hey, if we should read the Gospel in order to understand what they're even talking about, right? Maybe. And it's interesting some of the arguments he makes. So this rabbi copies the Gospel, and where does he copy it from? That's the big question, right? We don't know the answer to that. He had this Gospel available to him, and he copies it. So he intersperses the Gospel with his own what are called critical remarks. And the critical remarks are for the purposes of these debates with the Catholics. And he always introduces the critical remark as Mal Hamatik, the copyist said, which is how we know he copied it and didn't translate it. So the copyist says is the introduction, and he'll bring arguments. He'll bring 10 verses of Matthew, and then he'll say the copyist says. And one of his arguments, interestingly, is he says, wait a minute, here Jesus is saying that that the Sabbath hasn't been done away with. But the people we're debating, the Catholics, they don't follow the Sabbath. They say the Sabbath has been replaced with Sunday.
Right.
So he actually brings the words of Yeshua, of Jesus, as an argument against the Catholics in many instances. Right. So sometimes he's arguing against Jesus, but often he's just arguing against the Catholics.
Yeah.
And look, he's using the material he has, right?
See, and again, I think he's just feeding these Protestants what they are dying to hear, right? Oh, look at the Catholics, right?
He says, okay, let me copy this book. I'm a smart guy. I can read this, and I can punch some holes in their arguments and in their beliefs. And why do I want to do this? Because I don't want to be forcibly converted to Catholicism. Right. So that's really why they copied it. Why they preserved it in the first place, because he copied something that was available. That is an interesting question we don't have the answer to. It's possible this was just laying in a synagogue, somewhere. We have something called the Geniza in every synagogue. That when there's an old book, you stick it into this room in the back of the synagogue. And they found very, very old books in these rooms. There's a famous Geniza in Cairo where they found books that were from the Second Temple period, or there were copies of books from the Second Temple period, and the copies themselves were 1,000 years old. So books that were believed to have been lost, like the Wisdom of Sirach or Ben Sira, that we only had the Greek translation, they found several copies, in fact, of the Hebrew original in one of these archives.
Wow.
And so maybe he just found it in the archive.
The funny thing is, that was actually the Cairo Geniza. That was a Karaite synagogue, I believe. I'm pretty sure it was a Karaite synagogue.
What was it doing there? So now we've got to speculate. Now I don't know.
Right.
My speculation is, and there's some evidence to support this, is that there were Jews who believed in Yeshua who were living among the other Jews. And why were they doing that? Because early on in the church, they began to write books. Like for example, the famous book, I believe, by Irenaeus, called Against All Heresies. Well, being a Jew who practiced the Torah and believing in Yeshua was considered a heresy. And so if the Catholics believed you were under their authority, then you couldn't follow the Torah, you couldn't practice any form of Judaism, so they had to hide.
Yeah.
And they lived among the other Jews. That was the easiest place to hide. They maybe hid in other places too. But they would live among the other Jews, and over the generations, maybe they forget, oh yeah, our ancestors believed in Yeshua. There's a very interesting study by a professor at Hebrew University who brings evidence for this. He shows how in Jewish writings from the 12th century and on, and he says it must go back to a much earlier time, there's reference to how there's three angels of the presence. That is, the angels that stand in the presence of the Father in the throne room. One of those is Elijah. The other one is Enoch. And the third one, according to these Jewish writings from the Middle Ages, is named Yeshua.
Wow.
And he says, how is this possible? We have this in Jewish writings from Jews who lived in Christian countries, Jews who were persecuted daily in the name of this name, of the name of Yeshua. How could they have written about how there's three angels of the presence? And what does Elijah and Enoch have in common? That they're people who were flesh and blood people on earth who went up alive to heaven.
Yes.
Right.
Wow.
And for Yeshua to be the third angel of the presence, according to these sources in the Middle Ages, there has to be some explanation there. And his explanation is that there were Jews who believed in Yeshua, who were hiding among the other Jews, and they wrote these books.
Wow. How
Or
interesting.
the ideas that they preserved and traditions that they transmitted that ended up being reflected in these books. Because that can't be a coincidence that there's an angel in heaven, one of the three main angels, and standing in the throne room, or sitting in the throne room, I don't know, named Yeshua. So there is some evidence that this actually took place, that there were Jewish Christians, if you will, who believed in Yeshua, who practiced the Torah, and because of persecution by the mainstream church, by the Catholic and the Greek Orthodox churches, they had to live among the Jews under some peril as well, right?
Yeah.
So if they were found out, they would be turned over to the Catholics.
Right.
And if they didn't turn them over, the Jews would be in a lot of trouble.
Yes.
So they'd have to.
Now, that is absolutely fascinating. I want to dig into that. Back to your the Hebrew, the fact that all these Hebrew manuscripts have come out, and you dug into this. You conclude in your book Hebrew Yeshua versus Greek Jesus. You conclude that at least there, and I don't know if you've advanced this conclusion beyond this now as you've studied more and read more of the Hebrew narratives, that Yeshua did not contradict or tell people to actually go against Torah. He actually supported Torah with his teachings. Is that still?
He states that explicitly. It's Matthew 5:17.
Right.
Matthew 5:17 to me is one of the most interesting. It's the most interesting verse in the New Testament. Matthew 5:17. He says, "I did not come to do away with one jot or one tittle of."
For me, the most interesting verse is actually where Jesus in Mark, I believe, says the most important commandment is Shema Israel. Hear, O Israel.
Torah, I'm paraphrasing Torah, the prophets until all is fulfilled. The reason it's so interesting to me is, first of all, he tells you right there what his game plan is. Hey, I didn't come to do away with even one of the most minutest points of this book.
Right.
Okay, wow. All right.
Yeah.
So that's contrary to what Christianity teaches. And when I say Christianity, I mean, let me be more precise. It's contrary to what the Catholic Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, and mainline Protestant denominations have taught. Mm-hmm. And there's actually something really profound in I don't know, did you ever study the Nicene Creed?
Yes.
The Nicene Creed is a statement of faith, and somebody pointed this out to me years ago. In the Nicene Creed, they're saying what they believe, and they say, we believe, and they say, we believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, etc. And then they say, he became incarnate by the Holy Spirit and the Virgin Mary and was made human. He was crucified for us under Pontius Pilate. This is the core belief of most Christian denominations. And what is missing from this statement of belief? Everything between he was born of a virgin and he was crucified. So if you look at Matthew, everything from Matthew chapter 2 through Matthew, I believe it's chapter 26, is not part of the creed. It might be important, it might be something they study and do sermons on,
right,
but it's not part of the creed. I think it was Billy Graham or one of those guys who said that Christ came to the earth to do 3 days' work. Really? That might be true. I'm not going to argue with their theology. But why is it that the bulk of the Gospels don't deal with what you call the 3 days' work, meaning he came to earth to die and be resurrected, according to that? Okay, If that's the case, then why is it that and that might be true, right? That's a theology. I'm not going to argue with that.
Right.
But there must be some reason that the bulk of the Gospels deal with
Now he's saying things I agree with.
things that Yeshua taught here on earth. And that seems to be ignored by most Christian denominations. What I'm trying to do in this Hebrew Gospel Pearls is say, okay, you have your theology, you have your doctrine, that's fine. I'm not going to go near that. What I want to ask is, what is it that this Jewish man who lived 2,000 years ago, who I believe taught the Torah, what is it that he taught and did while he was here on earth, and what was its significance? That's what Hebrew Gospel Pearl is about. Can I just share one quick, Earl?
Yeah, I do want you to share a pearl with us.
So it says in the Gospel of Matthew that the Spirit alighted upon Jesus. That's in the Greek, being rested upon him or something like that. And reading in the Hebrew version of Matthew, it says that the Spirit sharta alav. And I translated that as it rested upon him, because that's how any child in Israel would translate it that way.
Okay.
Keith, who is my partner in this program,
right,
he asked me a simple question, what's the source of that word? And I'm like, what do you mean? It just means rest. Okay, but how did it come to mean that? And I look it up, and I realize, and it's one of those things that you know, but you have to put two and two together. And I realize that it literally means to soak. And so what the Hebrew actually says, the Greek says the Spirit rested upon him. So he comes up from the baptism in Matthew 3, and in the Hebrew it says...
Right, so he explained, this is called Shem Tov's Matthew, which I found really interesting. So there was a early rabbinic work, like from 600 years ago or so, where a rabbi kind of wrote a manual on how to debate with Christians. And in the back, as an appendix, he has a Hebrew version of Matthew. Now, a lot of people will say that it was a translation from the Greek. There is one person who, an academic, who wrote a critical version, and he believes at least parts of it may not be from a translation from the Greek. So it is possible, and some people believe, that what is original or different in Shem Tov's Matthew is might be actually from the original before it was translated from, that Matthew may have been written in Hebrew and then translated into Greek, possibly then edited, but that there may have been an original. And we know that the Ebionites supposedly had what was called the Gospel of the Hebrews, which was a version of the book of Matthew that didn't have the first couple of chapters. I think it definitely did not have the genealogy at the beginning.
Spirit soaked him, and it soaked upon him. It poured over on him and soaked him. And so wow, think how profound that is.
Wow.
How much more color and.
I'm not sure I would have translated Sharta as rested. I almost thought he said Shavta, but he's obviously not saying Sharta. And Hashra'at Shekhinah, right? I guess it is resting of the. It is a common, like the Mishnah talks about Hashra'at Hashkhinah, like the coming upon, the Spirit coming upon people. I don't think it's biblical language.
And texture, in a sense, it gives you to what happened there.
Yeah.
I think a deeper perspective. He comes up from the physical water of the Jordan, and then he's soaked in the Holy Spirit of God.
Wow, that is so profound. So you guys are doing a project of line by line, verse by verse, as much as possible on the Hebrew gospel. You're calling it Hebrew gospel pearls, and you're trying to extract, looking at, and one of the things I found fascinating was you discovered a cousin that you didn't know you had, who had apparently done what you're doing now in the 1800s. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Right. Well, it's actually one of the we were talking about doing this during the lockdown, and somebody wrote to me, one of the people who follows the program. He said, I'm an Orthodox Jew. I'm following what you're doing, and I think it's wonderful that you're talking about the gospel from a Hebrew perspective. He said, you're not the first person to do this. I'm like, okay, what do you mean? And I know I'm not the first person to do this from a Jewish perspective, right? There's a book called the Jewish Annotated New Testament, where a bunch of Jewish scholars got together and about 10, 15 years ago, and they put their perspective on the New Testament. He said, no, there was an ultra-Orthodox rabbi in the 1800s who wrote a commentary on Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I said, well, that can't possibly be true. An ultra-Orthodox rabbi, I would have heard of this.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I looked it up, and I found out. I actually bought the book. It was just translated into English in 2019, meaning a year ago.
That is so amazing.
Yeah, well, and then I actually went to look for the Hebrew original. There's one surviving copy in the world. It's in Paris at the National Library of France, and they have a photocopy at the National Library of Israel. So there's two copies, one's a photocopy of the other, of the Hebrew original. So somebody got a hold of this, a scholar at Yale University, and he translated it into English. So I get this book, and I immediately recognize the name of the author.
I'm not sure I've seen this. I watched this all the way through to here because I would actually be interested in knowing what this book is. I don't remember it.
That is who wrote the original Hebrew commentary. And I realize he's a cousin of mine from the name. And I look up the genealogy, and I see he's my second cousin 5 times removed. And he translated the gospel, he wrote a commentary on Matthew, Mark, and Luke in around 1879.
That's amazing.
And it was published in Hebrew, and then from Hebrew it was translated into French and into German. And so we have also the French and the German version. And I thought, how is this possible? I've never heard of this. And so I'm reading the introduction, and the scholar who translated and published this, he tells the story of how he went to it's a very famous family of rabbis, my cousins.
Yeah.
Right? They're one of the rabbis, was the leading rabbi of the United States in the 20th century. He's considered, in a sense, the founder of what's called modern Orthodox Judaism in the 20th century. Not the one who wrote the commentary, but this other rabbi who has the same last name, Soloveitchik. And so they went to the family historian.
Oh, so Nehemia claims he's a cousin of the Soloveitchiks. I guess it could be true. Yeah.
Historian. They were asking stories about different rabbis, and a lot of rabbis in this particular group of people with the same last name. And then they come to this one rabbi, Elijah Soloveitchik, and the family historian said, "We don't talk about him." He was
black sheep.
He definitely was the black sheep of the family because he had spent so much energy and time studying the New Testament, which was not considered acceptable in that community. There are Jews who have written commentaries going back 4 centuries, but those were always Jews who had converted to Christianity, Catholicism usually, or occasionally Protestantism in later centuries. And this rabbi.
So I just looked up Eliyahu Tzvi Soloveitchik, a grandson of Reb Chaim Volozhin, uncle of the Beis Halevi. Yosef. So don't talk about him. I'm not sure. So I'm looking at the Wikipedia article. In 1870, he published a Hebrew commentary on the Gospel of Matthew called Kol Koreh. Kol Koreh is generally what warnings, rabbinic warnings, are called, which was translated as the Bible, the Talmud, and the Gospel. The work followed the approach of Yaakov Enden, and sought to explain the Talmud to Christians and the Gospels to Jews, and to demonstrate the common grounds of belief. That's interesting. Also a thing. Yeah, I'm not sure why he's saying that we don't talk about him. It seems like the Soloveitchik who loved Jesus in Tablet magazine. Unfortunately, it's not available. I'm going to have to look that up. I might have to try to find a copy of this book, hopefully in Hebrew. Interesting.
Rabbi, according to this scholar who wrote the book a year ago, he says this is actually the first Jew who didn't convert, who remained, part of the mainstream Jewish movement, who wrote a commentary on the New Testament. And
I'm kind of surprised. Isaac Lichtenstein, he didn't convert, but he was an advocate of Jews actually converting to Christianity, which is weird. I understand, yeah.
I mentioned before how there was this rabbi in 1380 who wrote his critical remarks. Mm-hmm. You could say, well, isn't that a commentary? Well, it wasn't really a commentary. What that rabbi was trying to do is say, hey, this is what we can argue when we debate with the Catholics. Right? It wasn't really a commentary. It was a criticism.
Right.
This rabbi, Elijah Tzvi Soloveitchik, wrote an actual commentary in around 1878, 1879 on the Gospel of Matthew. You don't have to agree with everything he said. He had interesting perspectives. Sometimes he was really writing from a perspective of his own time.
Yeah.
Right? Meaning, like, he assumes that John the Baptist was an Essene. Well, the Essenes were the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. So in 1879, the Dead Sea Scrolls hadn't been discovered yet. So,
wow.
so he's working within the world that he knows, but he's coming from this perspective of ultra-Orthodox Judaism, and he remained an ultra-Orthodox Jew until he died.
Were the Essenes considered, even in the 1800s or prior to that, as would the Orthodox look at the Essenes as part of their sect, or just the Pharisees?
No, absolutely not. Only the Pharisees.
Only the
Pharisees. But what you could do with the Essenes is you could project any belief and practice you wanted onto them, because we didn't have their own writings to tell us what they believed. All we had was a short excerpt from Josephus about what they believed and who they were.
Ah.
And so there was a lot of things assigned to them that they had nothing to do with. When we actually got their writings, the Dead Sea Scrolls, we got a much better understanding of who they were. Let me read a passage that he writes. This is the rabbi. His name is Elijah, or Eliyahu Tzvi Soloveitchik, writing around 1879. And he's just written this commentary on Matthew, also later wrote a commentary on Mark and Luke. He says, I know that I will not escape from the criticism from both sides, both the Jews and the Christians, for writing this commentary. My Hebrew brethren will say, what happened to Rabbi Eliyahu? Yesterday he was one of us, and today he is filled with a new spirit. And new spirit here is meant as a derogatorily, as a sarcasm, right?
Right.
And my Christian brethren will say, this one who is a Jew comes to reveal to us the secrets of the gospel. How can we accept that he speaks correctly? And a true spirit dwells within him. Mm-hmm. He says these two extremes are really saying one thing. That is, it cannot be that what he is speaking with his mouth is what he believes with his heart. On this criticism, he says, my soul weeps uncontrollably.
Wow.
Only God knows, and God is my witness, that in this I am free of sin. When I read that, it really struck me. because for years I've been studying the New Testament and being criticized by both sides, the Jews and the Christians. The Jews say he must secretly be a Christian and he's converted and he's filled with a new spirit. Right? It's almost the same thing they say.
Right.
And then the Christians say, well, he must have a secret agenda. He wants to convert us to Judaism or destroy our faith. And they're both wrong. Right?
Yeah.
What I want to do is understand the Gospels in their Hebrew context. And why do I want to do that? One is I think it's actually an important question in and of itself. The New Testament is one of the foundation documents of Western civilization. We live in a time, I mean, not just a century, we live in a year where people are out to destroy Western civilization.
Yes.
Their stated objective is the destruction of Western civilization. And I say, hey, Western civilization is actually pretty good.
Yep.
I followed this fiction writer who writes about the Middle Ages, and I asked him, which of the periods that you write about would you like to live in? He said, I think we have a much better dental program here in the 21st century. Right? So the benefits of Western civilization are paramount to all, and those who want to destroy it, I suggest they go live in the third world that they think is so wonderful.
Yes.
And, I mean, look, we had that in Seattle where they created an enclave of the third world and it lasted a couple of weeks, and it was a nightmare.
Yep.
So I think it's one of the foundational documents of Western civilization, so it's important in and of itself. I also I'm a strong believer, and if you believe something, you should know what it is you believe,
Yes.
what the foundational sources of it are. And so the motto of my ministry, which you can find at nehemiaswall.com, is to empower people with information about the ancient Hebrew sources of their faith. Even if you don't agree with me, even if you have a different faith, I think it's important to empower people with that information. I've been blessed. Here, I want to state my Jewish privilege. I grew up with a father who was a rabbi and taught me on his knee about the ancient Hebrew sources of my faith.
Yes.
And I studied in kindergarten the Hebrew Aleph-Bet, along with the English alphabet. In second grade, I started reading the Torah and translating it verse by verse. And in third grade, the Mishnah, fourth grade, the Talmud.
So he's saying the precise opposite of what he said at the beginning, right? At the beginning, he was saying that he was taught about translations. How do you not see this?
It wasn't anything I did. I was thrust into that situation by the creator of the universe.
Wow.
And when I encounter people who yearn and desire to have information, they don't have access to that information, I feel I should be sharing that information with those
Wow.
who want to know that information. And I meet Christians all the time who say, Nehemia, help us understand, at least from your perspective, we might not agree with you, we might not, in the end, accept what you're saying, but give us your Jewish perspective
Yes.
on Yeshua, who was a Jew, and what he taught. And I feel I should share that with people who want to know that. I would want people to share with me information that I needed, and people do share with me information that I need.
Yeah.
And so I feel compelled, I feel called to share that information with those who want to know it.
Amen. Well, we are of one mind in that. Our ministry's name is B1 Ministries, and we connect to both the church world, the Jewish world, multiple different denominational worlds, from Baptist to Pentecostal to Catholic, and we connect to those in Orthodox Judaism and Conservative Reform and Karaite, and we try to find, like you, places where there is an understanding of common ground, but not just in the natural. One of my foundational principles is I really do, and I love what you're saying, because I really want to, and always have wanted to take in the proverb that says, buy the truth and sell it not. That I don't want to buy into fake news. I want to hear the scriptures. I want to understand the scriptures to the best of my abilities, and that comes from us finding some form of conversations with each other. And John chapter 17, Yeshua is having a prayer, and that prayer that he's having with his Father is recorded. It's the last prayer before he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane and then to crucifixion. And in that prayer, he makes a statement, and starting in verse 20 and 21, and he says, I pray, Father, that they, and he's speaking of his disciples, the Jewish disciples that were following him, and then of those that will hear the words that they speak. So that would be the Jews who believe in him as the Messiah, and the ones who are Gentile who are going to come to faith and believe in him. He says, I pray that they, the Jews and the Gentiles, may be one as you, Father, and I are one, that the world may know that I am from you. And so one of his great prayers at the end of his life was a prayer of unity, not uniformity, not that we agree on everything, because we never will, but that there be some form of unity for the credibility. And I think one of the things that has happened from a gospel perspective, from a man, I'm a Jewish man who does believe in Yeshua as Messiah, but from my perspective, one of the things that has discredited Yeshua is the division that is so prevalent throughout Christianity today. The arguments and the division, and not finding a place where there can be, let's seek truth. And I think what you're doing and what we try to do is to bring the whole book into value, the Genesis part forward, to say that this book is the foundation, it is the truth. And so the Hebraic understanding of Yeshua, of Matthew, of the Tanakh and the Torah, it's critical to understanding God's truth as he revealed it to us. And so I really appreciate you, Nehemia. I appreciate what you've done. I appreciate the work you're doing, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're visiting with Nehemia Gordon. You can find him at nehemiaswall.com, and just go there, and you can learn tons of great information. As you already realize, he has a wealth of wisdom and knowledge and great discussion, and you can join and be part of it. You can get tons of the great information that's available there, lots of resources, but you can also be part of his support team and get even more in-depth. And we are a member of his support team, and we value the friendship and relationship so much so. But Nehemia, thank you so much for giving us so much valuable time today.
My pleasure.
You have been listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemia Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemia's Makor Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiaswall.com.
Well, that's that, I'm actually so. I learned something. I did not know about this Kol Koreh by Rabbi Soloveitchik, which seems really interesting to me. And this article in Tablet Magazine claims that it has a haskama, it has an approbation from Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, which would be astounding if true. So I would love to see if this is. I would love to know. So apparently, Moritz Steinsteiner said that his personal copy of Kol Koreh has a page of with a commendation from Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, which would be really interesting if true. Yeah. If anybody has questions, I will hang around for a bit. But otherwise, that was our show for tonight. Yep. Is the Aramaic in the small portions of the Bible the same as the Aramaic in the Talmud? I do not believe so. No. My Aramaic is not incredibly strong. So there's, well, okay, first of all, there isn't that much difference from, let's say, Biblical Hebrew and Rabbinic Hebrew. So there wouldn't be much difference between the Biblical Aramaic and the Rabbinic Aramaic. But apparently, best I remember, it was written in what's referred to as Imperial Aramaic. This is not an area I am very well versed in. When I see Aramaic, I try to understand it and try. I'm not good enough to really compare it. I mean, certain things are obvious. For example, the Peshitta and the games they play with Bare Denasha, Din Denasha, that type of stuff, like that stares out at you. I haven't noticed anything particular about the Aramaic in the Bible, and the Aramaic in the Talmud. Honestly, usually we just, I mean, especially even with me, who I try to know every single word what it means when I study Talmud or Torah or anything like that. Exactly what it means. Even I don't have a very good grasp of Aramaic grammar. I probably should study it more. But maybe other people have better ones. Does Nathan of Gaza have a bad rep in Judaism? I have no idea who Nathan of Gaza is. So I would say no. But Nathan of Gaza was a theologian and author. Oh, that Nathan of Gaza. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. He has a very, very bad yeah. So he claimed to be Shabbatite Tzvi's like prophet. And to some extent, I think people consider him even worse than Shabbatite Tzvi himself, because you can argue that Shabbatite Tzvi was crazy, and this guy was more of an enabler. Yeah, not not a popular guy at all. I'll see you, Dominic. It's nice seeing you around. Be well. Anthony, is there still a fairly strong antagonism between Mizrahi and Ashkenazi Jews in Israel itself? Not really. It's, well, yes and no. There has been a lot of intermarriage. It's actually, unfortunately, more evident in the more religious communities. well, the secular communities. So there was a lot of racism among the secular, and so that's mostly gone away. And I would say among the secular, especially because there's been so much intermarriage, it's pretty much gone away. Part of the problem, I think, in the most traditional communities has been liturgies and different schools and things like that. But honestly, I mean, it is slowly going away as people are intermarrying a lot more. Certainly in the religious Zionist community, I think it's mostly gone away, mostly. But I mean, there has been, what there has not been that I know of is intermarriage in the prominent, among the prominent rabbis from the different traditions. But that's kind of like, so, Lithuanian Rosh Yeshivas don't really marry their kids to Hasidic Rebbes and the other way around so much. And that's kind of also been true among the Sephardim, the Mizrahi. I don't think it's as bad as it used to be, that's for sure. But there's also a lot of people who have grudges from back, like in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, things were really bad. There were people who thought of Mizrahi Jews basically as Arabs and treated them as such, especially among the secular Zionists. Also, this has always been confusing for me, but Sephardic Jews can also be either Mizrahi or Ashkenazi, right? It just means those expelled during the Inquisition, right? Kind of, sort of, not really. So, part of the confusion is what's called Sfard. So, there is Nusach Sfard, which is the Eastern European Jews, mostly Hasidic, who took on traditions from the Sephardic Jews. And there were Sephardic Jews who went and lived in Ashkenazi lands. Who are more Ashkenazi than really Sephardi, but directly, like the ones who went and lived in like Denmark, I think the Dutch, or in the Netherlands, right? But they're mostly, I mean, so when we talk about liturgies, there's Nusach Sfard, which is what the Hasidim use. There's Nusach Ashkenaz, which is what the Litvaks use. And there's Nusach Edot HaMizrach, which is what the actual Sephardim use, which is the Mizrahis and the Sephardim, right? So those are the three liturgies. But when it comes to halachic customs, like the actual halachic custom differences come from the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, Rabbi Cairo, he wrote the Sephardic Halacha, and Rabbi Isserles, who wrote a gloss, a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch by Rabbi Cairo, brought the Ashkenazi customs, most famously eating kitniot, right, legumes like rice on Passover. And so that's where the actual difference between Sephardi and Ashkenazi comes, and Mizrahim fall under Sephardi by that manner. I hope that cleared things up instead of making it more unclear. I know you said you were anti-Zionist, but would you have taken the British offer of a new state in colonial Kenya? One of the oddest things I've ever read about. I don't know what I would have done. I really don't. And, you know, it's not like I'm against moving to Israel. I am against attaching religious significance to the state of Israel. The Prime Minister of Israel is not a religious leader for me. The flag of Israel is not a religious article for me. The Israeli national anthem is not a religious anthem for me. And I don't think it should call itself the Jewish state. And the chief rabbis of Israel are elected mostly by mayors who are not necessarily religious. So it's like, that's what I oppose. So, yeah. Do you find the use of religion by secular Jews like Netanyahu to be cynical or inappropriate or just plain weird? Inappropriate, I would say, definitely. Don't think it's necessarily cynical, but I do kind of find it heretical. Inappropriate, yeah. Inappropriate is probably the right word for it. My pleasure. Good night. Seeking, thirsting, longing. Hello. Wow, this is a very heavy title. I didn't think it was so heavy. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on Nehemia. P.S. Channel name is based on Psalm 63. I see. Well, welcome. As a Christian, Nehemia surprisingly led me to biblical Unitarianism. Well, I'm glad to hear that. I mean, you just listen to this particular video that I did a commentary on, and it's just so wrong in so many ways. He knows better. He knows better than what he's saying. He's playing to an audience. So what am I supposed to say about that, you know? No, this particular video was it's called "Boiling a Kid in Its Mother's Milk." I'm not sure how many. I mean, I've watched a few of his videos. This one particularly got under my my skin, as you can see from the dislike and my comment. So I'm actually going to respond and say, I made a commentary video if you are interested. So. Nehemia's anti-rabbi bias is one of the reasons I stopped listening to him. I don't even know if he actually has a anti-rabbi bias. He says things which he knows are not true that Protestants will lap up, which that's what bothers me. I've detected that in Tovia Singer, but not Nehemia. Examples other than the kid in his mother's milk. Well, this whole video was like I spent the last 3 hours explaining that. Rabbi Tovia Singer, my understanding of him, what I would say about him, is he's the best Baptist rabbi I ever met. He would have been a great Baptist preacher. And I generally, I mean, don't agree with him on everything. I don't have any problems with him. Oh, no. This is, I've been going almost 3 hours now. Well, actually 3 hours now. I'm just hanging around and answering questions if people have them. I'm probably going to log off in a few minutes if nobody has a question.